Poor girl begs doctor to save MOM. Promises to pay later. Billionaire freezes when he sees her. Dr. Daniel Pierce moved through the gleaming corridors of the Pierce Medical Center flagship hospital with an air of quiet authority. At 45, he possessed the sharp intellect and decisive manner that had allowed him to transform his late father's single successful surgical practice into a nationwide chain of elite private hospitals. His dark hair was meticulously cut, his bespoke suit immaculate, his gaze sharp and appraising behind expensive eyeglasses. Pierce Medical Centers were renowned for cutting-edge technology, top-tier specialists, and, consequently, hefty price tags. They catered to the wealthy, the insured, the ones who could afford the best. Daniel was proud of the medical excellence. Yet somewhere beneath the polished surface of the Billionaire lingered a shadow, a hollow space carved out 20 years ago. He often walked the floors, not just for oversight, but perhaps subconsciously searching, scanning faces in waiting rooms, though he wouldn't admit for what. This evening, he was doing a final check-in with the emergency department, a place he found both professionally fascinating and personally draining. The controlled chaos, the constant oscillation between life-saving triumphs and devastating losses, served as a stark reminder of medicine's limits and life's fragility. Dr. Eva Rostova, the unflappable head of the ER, was briefing him near the nurse's station, her voice calm despite the surrounding urgency, the rhythmic beeping of monitors, the hurried footsteps, the muffled announcements over the PA system. Multiple fractures from the MVA in Trauma Bay 1, stable for now. Suspected cardiac event in Bay 3, awaiting cardiology consult. Suddenly, the automatic doors hissed open with unusual force, admitting a blast of chilly night air and a small, frantic figure. A girl, perhaps 12 years old, burst into the waiting area, her clothes thin jeans and a worn-out jacket looking slightly torn and damp from the drizzle outside. Her face was streaked with tears and grime, her curly brown hair escaping a haphazard ponytail in messy tendrils. She looked utterly terrified, her eyes wide and darting around wildly until they landed on Daniel, perhaps sensing his air of authority amidst the scrubs and uniforms. Ignoring the triage nurse who stepped forward saying, "Honey, you need to check in first," the girl scrambled past her and ran directly towards Daniel. Before he or Dr. Rostova could react, she stumbled to her knees before him, clutching desperately at the sleeve of his pristine white lab coat, one he donned occasionally for these rounds. Please, sir, you have to help my mom." Her voice was a high-pitched sob, thick with panic. "She's really sick. She can't breathe right, and she's burning up. We were in the alley. She just collapsed." Daniel felt a familiar weariness. He'd seen desperation countless times. Heartbreaking stories, impossible situations, pleas fueled by fear and helplessness. His hospital, despite its reputation, wasn't a charity ward. There were protocols, financial screenings, insurance verifications, the necessary, if sometimes harsh, realities of running a private healthcare system. Dr. Rostova moved forward gently. "Okay, sweetie, let's get up. Tell us what happened. Where's your mother?" But the girl clung to Daniel's coat, her knuckles white. "I don't have any money," she choked out, tears streaming freely now. "Not right now, but I'll get it. I'll work, I'll clean, I'll do anything. I promise. I'll pay you back later, every penny. Just please save her." Daniel's instinct was to gently disengage, to direct her towards the standard intake process, managed by social workers and financial counselors. It was the procedure. Compassion had its place, but pragmatism governed the institution. He began to formulate a calm, detached response, something about assessment and available resources. "Young lady," he started, his voice carefully neutral. "We need to assess the situation properly." Then she looked up. Her face, upturned towards his, was etched with terror and desperation. But it was her eyes that struck him like a physical blow. Large, expressive brown eyes, framed by thick lashes, currently swimming in tears. And the way her messy, curly brown hair fell across her forehead. Daniel froze. His breath hitched. The sounds of the ER faded into a dull roar. It was like looking at a ghost from 20 years ago. The resemblance was uncanny, startling, impossible. Those eyes, that hair, was Emily. His older sister, Emily, as she had looked at 16, vibrant, defiant, full of life, before the terrible argument, before she had stormed out of their parents' opulent house and vanished from their lives without a trace. His carefully constructed composure shattered. The billionaire CEO, the renowned doctor, vanished, replaced by the younger brother who had never stopped searching, never stopped grieving the sister who had disappeared in a thin air. "What?" His voice was a strangled whisper. He cleared his throat, trying again, his hand trembling slightly as he reached down, not to push her away, but to steady himself. "What's your name?" The girl sniffled, confused by a sudden change in demeanor. "Sophie," she stammered. "Sophie Hayes." "Hayes? Not Pierce?" "Of course not. But the face." "And your mother?" Daniel asked, his voice still shaking, his heart pounding against his ribs. "Where is she?" Sophie scrambled to her feet, pulling him urgently towards the entrance. "Outside, by the ambulance bay. Some people helped me get her here, but they couldn't stay." Daniel didn't wait. He signaled sharply to Dr. Rostova and a nearby trauma team. "Gurney, now! Trauma bay 2, clear it." He strode towards the entrance, Sophie clinging to his hand, her small fingers surprisingly strong. Just outside the doors, illuminated by the harsh fluorescent lights of the ambulance bay, lay a woman on a makeshift stretcher, likely a piece of discarded cardboard covered with thin blankets, attended by a nervous-looking paramedic from a city ambulance that must have just arrived. The woman was skeletal, her skin pale and clammy, her breathing shallow and rapid. Even from distance, Daniel could see the flush of high fever on her sunken cheeks. As the hospital team rushed forward with the gurney, carefully transferring the woman, Daniel moved closer, his gaze fixed on her face. It was ravaged by illness and years of hardship. Lines etched deep around her eyes and mouth, cheekbones stark beneath paper-thin skin, hair lank and dull. She looked far older than her 40-odd years. For a horrifying second, Daniel thought he must be mistaken, projecting his long-lost sister onto a desperately ill stranger. But then, her eyes fluttered open for a brief moment, unfocused, glazed with fever. And in that fleeting instant, beneath the pain and the premature aging, Daniel saw it. The same shape, the same deep brown color he remembered so vividly, the eyes that mirrored the girl clutching his hand. It was Emily, his sister, found, not in a triumphant reunion, but here, critically ill, destitute, brought to his own hospital by a desperate child who bore her image. The world tilted. He felt a wave of nausea, guilt, and a dizzying, terrifying relief all at once. He barked orders, his medical training kicking in on autopilot even as his mind reeled. "Severe pneumonia, likely septic. Start broad-spectrum antibiotics for oxygen, push fluids. Get respiratory and infectious disease down here stat. Full labs, blood cultures, portable chest x-ray." He followed the gurney as they rushed Emily into the trauma bay, his eyes locked on her frail form. The ghost of the past had materialized in the most devastating way imaginable. and her life was hanging by a thread. The controlled chaos of Trauma Bay, too, enveloped Daniel. Yet he felt strangely detached, observing the scene through a haze of shock and disbelief. His team, expertly trained and efficient, moved around Emily's frail form with practiced speed. For lines were inserted, monitors attached, oxygen masks secured. The rhythmic hiss of the ventilator soon took over, supporting her ragged breathing. Dr. Rostova was calmly giving orders, coordinating the response, her professionalism a stark contrast to the tempest raging inside Daniel. He stood near the foot of the gurney, his eyes tracing the lines on Emily's face. 20 years. 20 years of silence, of wondering, of fearing the worst. He'd imagined finding her countless times a chance encounter on a street, a response to one of the many private investigators he'd hired and eventually given up on. He'd pictured relief, anger, confusion, tears. He had never pictured this. His vibrant, rebellious sister reduced to this skeletal figure, fighting for her life in the emergency room of the hospital empire built partly on the family wealth she had rejected. He saw the small, faded scar above her left eyebrow, almost hidden by wrinkles now. She'd gotten it falling off her bike when she was 10, try to prove she could ride faster than him down the steep hill behind their childhood home. He remembered her triumphant, bloody grin afterwards, refusing to cry despite their mother's frantic ministrations. Where had that fire gone? Quenched by decades of hardship. Chest X-ray shows extensive bilateral infiltrates, consistent with severe pneumonia, a resident reported, holding up the film. White count is critically elevated. Lactate is high. She's septic, Dr. Pierce. Septic shock, a cascade of organ dysfunction triggered by overwhelming infection. Malnutrition would have weakened her immune system, leaving her horribly vulnerable. Daniel's medical mind analyzed the data dispassionately, even as his heart clenched with fear. Initiate sepsis protocol, Daniel ordered, his voice hoarse but firm. Aggressive fluid resuscitation, vasopressors if needed to maintain perfusion. We need to support her organs while the antibiotics work. What's her core temp? 104.8 Fahrenheit, 40.4 Celsius, and climbing. A nurse responded, adjusting a cooling blanket. He needed to be closer to see everything to ensure nothing was missed. Gloves, gown, he requested automatically. Though his executive role rarely saw him performing procedures anymore, his surgical skills and critical care knowledge were sharp. He wouldn't take the lead. Dr. Rostova and the specialists were more than capable, but he needed to be involved, his presence a silent insistence. Save her. As he gowned up and approached the head of the bed, adjusting the oxygen mask, his hand brushed against her matted hair. It was brittle, lifeless, so different from the glossy, unruly curls he remembered. He saw the gray streaks mixed with the brown. He saw the hollows in her temples, the thinness of her lips. The vibrant energy that had defined Emily was buried deep beneath layers of suffering. Guilt washed over him, cold and suffocating. Why hadn't he found her sooner? Why hadn't he tried harder? Had he given up too easily, retreating into his work, his success a hollow monument built over her absence? He remembered the fight. It had been simmering for weeks. Emily, fiercely independent and artistic, wanted to defer college, travel, maybe join a theater group. Their parents, pillars of society obsessed with legacy and appearances, were appalled. Their father had demanded she follow Daniel into medicine or law. Their mother had wept about disappointment and reputation. Daniel, then ambitious and eager to please, had sided with his parents, urging Emily to be reasonable. The final confrontation had been explosive. Harsh words were exchanged. Emily had accused them all of stifling her, of caring only about appearances. His father had threatened to cut her off financially. Emily, tears streaming down her face but her eyes blazing with defiance, had screamed, "Fine. I don't need your money. I don't need any of you." She had grabbed a backpack, stormed out, and never looked back. Daniel had watched her go, angry and self-righteous, never imagining it would be the last time he saw her for 2 decades. The guilt of his silence, his complicity, gnawed at him now. Blood pressure is dropping despite fluids, Dr. Rostova stated calmly, interrupting his torturous thoughts. Starting norepinephrine drip, Daniel focused back on the monitors, on the grim numbers reflecting the battle raging within Emily's body. He conferred with the infectious disease specialist, discussing antibiotic choices, potential resistant organisms. He spoke with the respiratory therapist about ventilator settings. He was Dr. Pierce, the expert, the decisive leader. But beneath the surface, he was just Danny, the little brother terrified of losing his sister all over again, this time permanently. Hours crawled by. The initial frantic rush subsided into the tense vigilance of critical care. Emily was moved to the intensive care unit, her condition precarious. Daniel remained a silent fixture in the room, watching her chest rise and fall with the ventilator's rhythm. He had delegated his CEO duties via curt emails and phone calls to his assistant, Maria, clearing his schedule indefinitely with minimal explanation. Sophie had been taken care of by a compassionate social worker, given food and a quiet room to rest. Daniel had briefly checked on her earlier. She had cried herself to sleep, clutching a worn teddy bear he vaguely recognized as the type sold in cheap corner stores. Seeing her small, trusting face, so like Emily's, had been another stab of guilt. This child had grown up in poverty, likely never knowing the comfort and security that should have been her birthright. As the first hint of dawn painted the sky outside the ICU window, Daniel sat by Emily's bedside. The machines beeped steadily, a fragile lifeline. He reached out, carefully taking her hand. It felt frail, bird-like in his own. Her skin was still hot, but the terrifying fever spikes had subsided slightly. He whispered, the childhood nickname escaping his lips for the first time in 20 years. Each is done. I'm here. Just hold on. Please hold on. He wasn't sure if she could hear him, if any part of her consciousness registered his presence. But he needed to say it to bridge the chasm of silence. He thought of Sophie's desperate plea. "I'll pay you back later." The irony was crushing. He was the one with the insurmountable debt, a debt of time, of love, of protection owed to the sister he had failed and to the niece he never knew existed. He could pour all his billions into Emily's care, but could never truly repay the lost years, the suffering endured. All he could do now was fight for a future and pray it wasn't too late. His hands, usually steady whether holding a scalpel or signing a multi-million-dollar deal, trembled slightly as he held hers, whispering promises into the sterile air of the ICU. The days following Emily's admission blurred into a monotonous cycle of tense waiting, punctuated by medical updates and brief, emotionally charged visits with Sophie. Emily remained in the ICU, heavily sedated and reliant on the ventilator, though her vital signs began a slow, painstaking stabilization. The powerful antibiotics were fighting the infection, but years of malnutrition had left her body weak, her recovery trajectory uncertain. Daniel practically lived at the hospital. He had Maria forward only the most critical business decisions to his tablet, which he dealt with distractedly from the uncomfortable chair in the family waiting lounge or Emily's bedside. His pristine suits were replaced by comfortable slacks and sweaters, his usual sharp focus blurred by exhaustion and anxiety. The hospital staff treated him with deference, but also with a curious sympathy, sensing the deep personal drama unfolding beneath his professional exterior. Dr. Rostova, in particular, offered quiet support, ensuring he received honest, unvarnished updates. His main solace, surprisingly, became Sophie. After her initial terror subsided, replaced by the dull ache of worry, she began to talk. Daniel would sit with her in the family lounge, bringing her food from the cafeteria, which she devoured gratefully, coloring books, or simply sitting in silence. He learned she was bright, observant, and fiercely protective of her mother. "Mommy always told me to be strong," she said one afternoon, carefully coloring a picture of a flower. She said we got to look out for each other, 'cause nobody else will. This simple statement, delivered with childlike gravity, pierced Daniel's heart. He gently probed for details about their life, careful not to overwhelm her. Sophie's narrative was fragmented, seen through a child's eyes. Moving constantly, Mommy called it adventures, living in cramped rooms or shelters. Sometimes they had bunk beds. Her mother working long hours at low-paying jobs cleaning Lodi, waitressing, seasonal farm work. There was no mention of grandparents, aunts, uncles, or cousins. Their world consisted only of each other. "What about your dad?" Daniel asked cautiously one day. Sophie shrugged, her crayon hovering over the page. "Mommy said he left before I was born. Said he wasn't nice. We don't talk about him." Abandonment upon abandonment. Emily had run from one family only to be deserted by the man she'd had a child with. Daniel felt a fresh wave of anger at his parents for their rigidity, at himself for his youthful complicity, at this anonymous man for his cruelty, and most of all, at the circumstances that had forced Emily and Sophie into such a harsh existence. He asked Maria to begin a discreet, compassionate investigation. Find out everything you can about Emily Pierce, missing since 20 years ago. She may have used aliases. The daughter's name is Sophie Hayes. Mother's name might be listed as Emily Hayes or similar. Start around the time Sophie would have been born, maybe 13 years ago. Look for shelter records, hospital visits, temporary employment, anything. But Maria, he stressed, absolute discretion. No one connects this back to me or the hospital ownership yet. This is deeply personal. Maria, loyal and perceptive, simply nodded. "Understand, Dr. Pierce. I'll be careful." While Maria started digging into the painful past, Daniel kept vigil in the present. He read medical journals by Emily's bedside, half comprehending the words, his mind drifting back constantly. He remembered Emily teaching him to ride his first two-wheeler, her patience contrasting with her father's brusque instructions. He remembered her sneaking him extra cookies, defending him against a neighborhood bully, sharing secrets whispered late at night. How had they gone from that closeness to 20 years of absolute silence? The choral replayed in his mind endlessly. His father's booming voice. A Pierce does not waste time on foolish artistic endeavors. You will go to university. You will choose a respectable profession. His mother's tearful plea. "Emily, darling, think of the family. Think of your future." And his own contribution, mumbled but damning, maybe Dad's right, just for a few years get a degree first. He saw again the look of betrayal in Emily's eyes before she turned and fled. Had his words been the final straw? He realized with sickening clarity that his success, the empire he commanded, was built on the very foundation of expectations Emily had rejected. He had become the son his parents wanted, achieving the status and wealth they valued, while Emily had paid the price for her defiance, living a life antithetical to everything the Pierce name represented. One evening, sitting beside Emily, watching the slow, steady rise and fall of her chest, He found himself talking to her, pouring out the guilt he'd carried for 2 decades. "I'm so sorry, Em," he whispered, his voice thick. "I was young, arrogant. I wanted Dad's approval so badly. I should have stood up for you. I should have understood. When you left, I was angry at first, then worried. Dad hired investigators, but quietly. He was more concerned about scandal than about you, I think." He paused, swallowing hard. "And I let him manage it. I focused on medical school, residency. It was easier than facing the fact that you were gone, that maybe I played a part in it. I told myself you'd call when you were ready, but you never did. And eventually, I stopped looking so hard. It hurts to admit that." He wasn't sure if she heard, but the confession felt necessary, a first step toward a reconciliation that might never happen if she didn't recover. A few days later, Maria brought him her initial findings. It was a bleak tapestry woven from public records and database searches. Emily Pierce seemed to vanish after leaving home. Then, about 7 years later, an Emily Hayes surfaced in sporadic records emergency room, visits for minor illnesses, temporary addresses at women's shelters in different states, short-term jobs registered under that name, and a plausible social security number. The timeline roughly matched Sophie's age. There were long gaps, periods where she seemed to exist completely off the grid. It painted a picture of a transient, precarious existence, constantly battling poverty and instability. "There's no record of a marriage," Maria reported softly, "and no consistent address for more than 6 months at a time. The last known location before Chicago was a migrant workers' camp in Central California." Daniel closed his eyes, the stark reality confirming his worst fears. Emily hadn't just been living modestly. She'd been struggling for basic survival on the fringes of society. And she had done it all while raising a child. He looked back towards Emily's bed. They had started slowly weaning her off sedation, hoping to assess her neurological function, hoping she could soon breathe on her own. The moment of truth was approaching. Would she wake up? Would she recognize him? And if she did, what then? How could they possibly bridge the chasm of 20 lost years, filled with so much pain, silence, and regret? He could only wait and hope and prepare himself for the storm of emotion that recognition, if it came, would surely unleash. The process of waking Emily was slow and nerve-wracking. As the sedatives were gradually reduced, she began to stir, moaning softly, her brow furrowed in discomfort or confusion. Daniel was a constant presence, murmuring reassurances, holding her hand, terrified of what her first lucid moments might bring. Sophie, too, was allowed short visits, her small hand clutching her mother's, whispering, "Wake up, Mommy. Please wake up." Finally, one afternoon, Emily's eyes fluttered open and stayed open. The initial gaze was unfocused, scanning the unfamiliar ceiling, the medical equipment. Then, her eyes drifted to Daniel, sitting tensely by her bedside. She blinked slowly, confusion clouding her features. "Why?" Her voice was a dry rasp, barely audible around the endotracheal tube, still assisting her breathing. Daniel leaned closer, his heart pounding. "Ing? It's me. It's Danny." Her eyes widened slightly. She stared at him, really stared for a long, agonizing moment. Recognition flickered, warring with disbelief. She saw the familiar dark hair, now threaded with silver, the shape of the face so like her own father's, yet softened with age and an expression of profound worry she'd never seen directed at her before. Tears welled in her eyes, slow and heavy, tracking paths down her sunken cheeks. A choked sound escaped her, a mixture of sob and gasp. She tried to lift her hand, weakly, towards him. Daniel gently took it, his own tears blurring his vision. "I'm here, Em. You're safe. You're in the hospital. You were very sick, but you're getting better. Emily just stared at him, the questions, the accusations, the sheer shock of his presence overwhelming her ability to speak. The ventilator hissed, a stark reminder of her fragility. Over the next few days, as Emily grew stronger and the breathing tube was finally removed, the story began to unfold in fragmented pieces, punctuated by tears, long silences, and exhaustion. Daniel listened patiently, holding back his own torrent of questions and guilt, letting her speak at her own pace. "I was so angry," she whispered, her voice weak but clear, recounting the night she left. "At Dad, at Mom, at you, for not understanding. I just wanted to get away, to prove I could make it on my own." She had hitchhiked, worked odd jobs, lived hand to mouth. The first few years were a blur of naive defiance, slowly ground down by harsh reality. She cut off all contact, partly out of pride, partly out of fear of being dragged back. Then came Sophie's father, charming at first, promising stability, but ultimately proving unreliable, then cruel, disappearing soon after learning Emily was pregnant. Having Sophie, Emily's voice softened, a faint light entering her tired eyes as she looked towards the door, expecting her daughter. It changed everything. Suddenly, it wasn't just about me anymore. I had this tiny person depending on me. The shame had kept her away then, deeper and more potent than the initial anger. How could she return home, pregnant, abandoned, a failure by her family's standards? What would her parents say? What would Daniel, the successful doctor-to-be, think? The longer she stayed away, the harder it became to bridge the gap. Pride hardened into a protective shell. Survival became her sole focus. There were times, she confessed, her voice trembling, when I thought about calling, especially after Mom and Dad passed. Daniel had gently broken the news of their parents' deaths years earlier, a separate wave of grief washing over Emily. But what would I say? "Hi, it's me, your failure sister, living in a shelter with my kid?" I couldn't. The shame, it was too much. Daniel reached out, resting his hand over hers. None of that matters. You survived. You raised Sophie. You were incredibly strong. I failed you. By not finding you, by not making it clear that you were always wanted, always missed no matter what." He told her about his own guilt, his regret over the argument, his hollow success that felt meaningless without family. He apologized fully and without reservation, not just for his part in the initial quarrel, but for the years of silence, for giving up the search too soon. Emily listened, tears streaming silently. Forgiveness wasn't instant. 20 years of hurt couldn't be erased in a day. But in Daniel's evident remorse, in his unwavering presence at her bedside, she saw a glimmer of the brother she remembered, the Danny she had protected and confided in. Introducing Sophie to the truth required careful handling. Daniel sat with them both one afternoon, Emily propped up in bed, Sophie nestled beside her. "Sophie," Daniel began gently, "you know how much your mom loves you, right? And how she always protected you." Sophie nodded solemnly. "Well, a long, long time ago, before you were born, your mom and I grew up together. We were brother and sister." Sophie's eyes widened. She looked from Daniel to Emily and back again, like in storybooks. Emily managed a weak smile, stroking Sophie's hair. "Yes, sweetie, like in storybooks. Danny Dr. Pierce is my little brother. That makes him your uncle." Sophie stared at Daniel, processing this revelation. "My uncle," she repeated slowly. Then, a wide smile spread across her face. "I have an uncle? Wow. Does this mean I have cousins too?" Daniel chuckled, the sound thick with emotion. "No cousins yet, Sophie. Just me for now. But you have an uncle who already thinks you're pretty amazing." He felt a lightness he hadn't experienced in years. The secret was out. The foundations for rebuilding were laid. Emily reached out, her frail hand covering Daniel's. "Thank you, Danny," she whispered, her voice choked with tears. "For finding us. For everything." He squeezed her hand, his own tears falling freely now. "Welcome home, Em." The sterile hospital room, a place of crisis and fear just days before, felt transformed. The air hummed not just with the sound of monitors, but with the fragile, tentative pulse of a family rediscovering itself, bound together by shared history, profound regret, and the powerful, resilient force of love. The path ahead would be long, requiring patience, understanding, and immense healing. But for the first time in 20 years, it was a path they would walk together. Emily's recovery continued steadily, buoyed by expert medical care and the powerful tonic of rediscovered family. As she regained physical strength, the deeper emotional healing began. There were long talks with Daniel, sometimes punctuated by tears, sometimes by tentative laughter as they recalled shared childhood memories, carefully navigating the minefield of the past 2 decades. Daniel, accustomed to decisive action, channeled his energy into making practical arrangements. He knew throwing money at the situation wasn't the answer, but providing stability was crucial. He consulted with hospital social workers and therapists to ensure Emily and Sophie had comprehensive support. Instead of moving them into his own imposing mansion, which he sensed would be overwhelming, he found a bright, comfortable apartment in a quiet neighborhood not far from the hospital and one of the city's best schools. He had it furnished simply but warmly, ensuring Emily had input via photos and online catalogs from her hospital bed. The transition from hospital to apartment was a significant milestone. For Sophie, having her own room, a stable address, and the promise of starting school without the fear of imminent departure was a quiet miracle. She explored the apartment with wide-eyed wonder, her initial shyness around Daniel slowly replaced by the easy affection of a niece discovering a long-lost uncle. For Emily, the adjustment was more complex. After 20 years of hypervigilance and constant struggle, accepting help was difficult. Letting go of the ingrained habits of poverty, the fear of scarcity, the distrust of stability took time. She felt pangs of guilt enjoying comforts she'd long denied herself. Moments of feeling like an undeserving outsider in this new life Daniel was providing. Daniel, sensing this, was patient. He didn't push. He involved her in decisions, respected her independence where he could, and focused on simply being present, a steady source of support rather than an overwhelming benefactor. Daniel himself was undergoing a profound transformation. He delegated more responsibility at Pierce Medical Centers, carving out dedicated time for Emily and Sophie. He discovered the simple joys of family life he'd long been denied, helping Sophie with her homework, and realizing 12th grade math was harder than he remembered, attending her first school play, sharing quiet dinners with Emily where they talked not just about the past, but about tentative plans for the future. His life, once defined by boardrooms and balance sheets, gained a new, richer dimension. The hollow space within him began to fill. As Emily grew stronger, she expressed a desire to contribute, to find purpose beyond her recovery. Her artistic spark, suppressed for so long, flickered anew. Daniel arranged for art supplies, and she began sketching, tentatively at first, then with growing confidence. They talked about possibilities, maybe taking classes, volunteering at a community art center. Daniel made it clear he would support whatever path she chose, emphasizing her well-being above all else. The memory of Sophie's desperate plea in the ER, "I'll pay you back later, I promise," often echoed in Daniel's mind. It became the catalyst for a new idea, a way to channel his immense resources and his newfound gratitude into something meaningful, something that honored Emily's resilience and Sophie's courage. He established the Emily Foundation. Its mission was clear: to provide critical medical funding and support for underprivileged children and families facing health crises, ensuring that no child would ever have to kneel and beg for a loved one's life, that financial barriers would not stand in the way of essential care. He seeded it with a substantial portion of his personal fortune, separate from the hospital business, ensuring its sole focus was charitable. He involved Emily in the foundation's development, valuing her insights born from lived experience. Her perspective was invaluable in shaping programs that offered not just financial aid, but also practical support, temporary housing, transportation, social work services addressing the complex web of challenges faced by families in crisis. One evening, months after Emily's discharge, the three of them were gathered in the cozy living room of the apartment. Emily was sketching in a notepad. Sophie was reading a book for school, and Daniel was looking over preliminary plans for the Foundation's first major project, funding a dedicated pediatric wing in a public hospital serving a low-income community. A sense of quiet contentment filled the room, a stark contrast to the turmoil of their reunion. Sophie looked up from her book, her expression thoughtful. "Uncle Danny," she said, "remember when I promised to pay you back?" Daniel smiled, meeting her earnest gaze. "I remember, Sophie." "Well," she continued seriously, "I still will. When I grow up, I'm going to help people too. Maybe I'll be a doctor like you, or maybe I'll help Mommy with art therapy for sick kids. I'll pay it back by helping others." Tears pricked Daniel's eyes. He reached out and ruffled her hair. "Sophie, you already have," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You brought your mom back to me. You brought us back together. That's a debt I can never repay you for." He looked at Emily, who was watching them, her own eyes shining. "But helping others, like you said, that's the best way to pay anything forward. That's what the Emily Foundation is all about." Emily reached out, placing her hand on Daniel's arm. "Our family foundation," she corrected gently, a soft smile gracing her lips. Daniel nodded, a profound sense of peace settling over him. The sterile, cold hospital where his sister had nearly died had, against all odds, become the crucible for their family's rebirth. The trauma had forged unbreakable bonds. His wealth, once a symbol of his solitary success, now felt like a tool for connection, for healing, for creating a legacy far more meaningful than any balance sheet could measure. He looked at his sister, truly seeing the resilient spirit beneath the scars, and at his niece, bright-eyed and full of promise, and knew that his life, irrevocably altered, was finally, truly whole.